According to a survey by the Major Cities Chiefs Association in 2020, there were 8,077 homicides in 66 major U.S. cities, up 33% from 2019, and the uptick is continuing into this year. President Biden laid out plans to confront the rise in violent crime by focusing on gun control. Here's what he had to say.
If you wanted to think you need to have weapons to take on the government, you need F-15s and maybe some nuclear weapons. The point is that there's always been the ability to rationally limit the type of weapon that can be owned and who can own it. The last time we had data on this issue of who was purchasing guns was more than 20 years ago. 5% of gun dealers, turns out, in the study we did, showed that 90% of illegal guns were found at the crime scenes sold by 5% of gun dealers. 5% sold 90% of the guns found at crime scenes. And these merchants of death are breaking the law for profit.
The Biden White House has also boasted of its position on boosting funding for police and supporting a more robust police presence.
First, let me just note that the president ran and won the most votes of any candidate in history on a platform of boosting funding for law enforcement after Republicans spent decades trying to cut the COPS program. There's record of that. That doesn't require anyone having new comments, and then also stood in the way of crucial funding needed to prevent the laying off of police officers as crimes increased. That's a simple statement of fact.
New York GOP Congresswoman Elise Stefanik criticized Biden's handling of the rise in homicides.
President Biden has failed to protect Americans from the surge in violent crime, a true crime crisis that we are seeing across America. Just this past weekend, there was a 21-year-old Marine shot in broad daylight in Times Square. His family lives in my district. He is originally from my district, so this impacts every community, urban, suburban, and rural. We need to secure our borders, secure our streets. The Democrats' defund the police rhetoric and policies are making that more difficult.
We have new exclusive Hill-HarrisX data on the matter, so let's take a look at that.
We have an opportunity to come together now as Democrats and Republicans, as fellow Americans, to fulfill the first responsibility of government on our democracy, to keep each other safe.
So overall, as you saw, voters are split 50-50 on how much confidence they have in Biden's ability to address the rise in homicides in cities across the country, including 16% saying they're very confident, while 30% say they're not confident at all. Ryan, what's your take on all of that?
Putting all the numbers together gives you a distorted picture in a way that where it appears that we're a divided country on this. In fact, we're divided into partisan and geographical camps. Mm-hmm. But once you sort for that, everybody seems to agree in different areas. What I found most interesting is that if you look let's put 806 back up on there, because this is the one that really struck me, where rural voters are not confident at all that Biden's going to be able to handle this by 73%, whereas urban voters, where you're seeing most of the rise in these homicides, by 78% are very confident. That only makes sense in two contexts. One, how much of this is a media-driven phenomenon? Some of it is, some of it is not. There is an actual rise in homicides. So then why would it be that in urban areas that are seeing this, you're seeing confidence in Biden, but in rural areas that are not seeing as much of this, you're not seeing confidence, and that goes back to the partisan number.
I was going to say, right.
Yes, and so the Democrats say by 75% they're confident in Biden's ability to handle this, and Republicans say by 82% that they're not confident.
Right.
And so and Republicans live in rural areas, Democrats live in urban areas. Boom, you get those numbers.
Yeah, and what's actually interesting when you add to this is that the homicides are not just up in cities. They're actually, early indications are that they're up across the board, even in towns that are smaller than 10,000 people. So it's not as though it's just these urban voters who are most exposed to the homicide spike. When we talk about increases in crime, it's interesting because there are actually some violent crimes that went down, robberies, for instance, over the course of the pandemic.
Do we have those numbers to put up?
And that's it.
The crime numbers.
Right. And crime overall, I think, is an important thing to understand in this, because homicides are just a part of what we think of when we're asked by pollsters questions about crime. And another really, really interesting thing about this particular question is that it's asking about confidence in the president of the United States to tackle it. So it's saying, do you have confidence that the head of the executive branch is going to be able to tackle this? And that in and of itself, the fact that we're actually even asking that question, I find very interesting to begin with, because I would love to see a regulation that Joe Biden proposes when it comes to gun control, which is what he wants to talk about, what Democrats want to talk about, a regulation that would actually have stopped most of those homicides, if even a significant chunk of those homicides. It's a great way for Democrats to distract. We saw them sort of go to the policing aspect of it, but most of what Democrats propose when it comes to gun control would not actually deal with these particular types of crime unless they went full in, right? You would have to take extremely drastic gun control measures to actually deal with rises in homicides like this, and that is not what Biden is proposing.
Right. And the crime numbers are 801, if we can roll that tear sheet. And what it shows you is that there is this divergence between homicides spiking by this, as you see, going from 6,000 to 8,000. But then you see rape and robbery both declining, and you see an uptick in aggravated assault, but not as huge as an uptick in homicides. And so so then you ask yourself, okay, well, what is the difference between these violent crimes and homicide? And in many cases, the difference is the presence of a weapon, is the presence of a gun. And so that can be the driving cause, and you're going to see Democrats make this, I think, their defense on this issue for the next generation. But you're right, in order to unwind that, you would not just have to implement serious gun control measures. You'd have to start pulling guns off the streets. Although I have seen some statistics that there has been a surge in gun purchases, since the pandemic, and so and police are saying they are seeing more weapons. In
legal gun purchases or just in gun purchases?
Both. And the legal gun purchases, wind up in the hands of people who are not allowed to be owning them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But again, if you look at what's actually happening in the spikes, and if you look at how these homicides are being committed, it's to the point you just made, you are going to have to talk about grabbing guns, basically, and confiscating guns. Otherwise, you're just sort of nibbling around the edges, and most of those regulations are going to be regulating legal gun owners, not illegal gun owners to begin with, and they're not going to do anything that actually meaningfully tackles the issue of illegal gun ownership and the use of illegal firearms in those homicides, unless, exactly like you just said, Joe Biden wants to talk about grabbing guns off the street.
And even beyond that, something like more than 90% of homicides that are committed by a firearm are committed by a handgun. whereas the media and Democrats
Right.
just want to talk about weapons of war.
Right.
Because those are the splashy weapons that are used in the most flagrant mass shootings,
Which they can't even define or honestly describe.
Right, and I mean they can try, and then the manufacturers figure out ways to do this and that, and like what's the difference between a hand? Is it the length of the barrel? Is it the length of the So that becomes a problem. But even if you could define it, you're talking about less than 10% of the killings and the shootings that are being done with the firearm. So I feel like, and I'm curious if this is your sense too, I feel like we've now settled into the camps that we will be in for the next generation, which is Democrats saying we actually want more money for police and we want gun control, and Republicans saying no, you actually want to defund the police and gun control has nothing to do with it, and we'll just shout that at each other until the sun explodes.
I think that's true, and what's interesting is to see how the Biden administration pivoted from the guns to the police, because you have to realize, if you're on the left, that short of basically getting into those heavy regulations of firearms and taking people's guns away, you are not going to do much to actually tackle those guns that are used in those homicides and the reasons that they're used in those homicides. And that's why it's sort of the fallback is talking about police, and that is a strong fallback for Democrats. Where else do they have to go? Unless they start making those really, really, really radical gun policies, they then have to fall back on police. And again, where else do they have to go after that? That's really their go-to. Otherwise, they have little answer to this. I mean, I would suggest the country has little answer to this. These numbers, by the way, that we're seeing from the pandemic are still dramatically down in some cities from what they were like in like the 90s, which is a victory, I would say, in and of itself. It's still sad. We've lost probably an extra 4,000 to 5,000 people because of the increase in homicides over the course of the last year or more, which is an incredible and a stunning number. We are still down in a lot of major cities from what it was decades ago. That's good. But I think to your point about what are we in the camps that we're going to be in for at least a generation, I think probably we are, because to an extent it's like both parties are out of answers that are politically feasible.
Right. And I'd say, ironically, the country that has the radical gun policy, and if you define radical by almost unique in the world, is the United States. Although allowing 300 plus million weapons to even exist. And there's an interesting tie-in to the segment we did earlier on Facebook, banning the funky academic for posting a piece of the Declaration of Independence. That piece that he banned didn't just talk about the king inciting slave revolts. It also talked about the king not allowing the settlers to slaughter the Native Americans and to move west and bringing the savages onto them. It's this violent culture that was produced, in the 1600s and 1700s, that distinguished the United States, what later became the United States, in a lot of ways, and we still have that violent culture shot through us. And when the Second Amendment was written into the Constitution, part of it very much was about allowing settlers to be armed, not just so that they could defend themselves against their own federal government, but so they could defend themselves against Native American governments and confederations. And everybody always couches it in terms of defense, but obviously it was offense. They wanted to push past the Appalachians and deep into there. That Second Amendment has then produced this situation where we have several guns for every person in the country.
And yet it also was a crucial defense in that conflict against their own government. And that's where the culture of violence that you mentioned, that's why it is so ingrained deeply. And I would say it's the culture of guns. That's why it is so ingrained deeply in the American psyche. And to accept the term radical in your terms, if we accept it, then we still accept that there would have to be radical change to undo that. That would be a very dramatic change for the public. And that's why I think Democrats, a lot of them would probably actually like to take that step and would like to approach some of that, because we are very divided on gun use in this country, on partisan lines, and not entirely on partisan lines, but on partisan lines. And so I think Democrats would love to take that step. A lot of Democrats would love to take that step, but it would be such a public struggle. I'm telling you, on the right, You're asking for,
Sure.
and I know like the left knows that, and that's why they don't do it. But I still think that's why, it would require, it's a fair definition of the steps that would need to be taken to call them radical, because it's undoing something in a dramatic way.
Although I would say it's never actually affected real resistance to the federal government. The one time that people tried it with the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington and Hamilton marched in there and smashed them in like a weekend.
Right.
So yeah, you need a lot. The Second Amendment really wasn't about throwing in one extra check on federal power. That's kind of a myth that's evolved over the years.
It functions as it, though.
Never effectively.
But it does function as a check on federal power. I mean, there's just no way to get around that.
Does it?
Absolutely. I mean, especially from a deterrent perspective, it's absolutely seen that way. And that's important to the people who own those weapons, especially in rural areas.
I'm not so sure about that, but
you live in Vermont now. You have to take up the culture.
Everybody's got a gun there, that's for sure.
Well, tomorrow on Rising, we have another great show planned for all of you. Brianna Joy Gray and Rachel Bovert are here, and Team Rising is in the house.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we will see you all tomorrow.